Hi everyone, Harinda here. We're really excited to launch the second season of the Rethinking Tech podcast. In the first season, Aparna and I tried to have those meaningful conversations surrounding how technology has permeated into all layers of our lives to cover geopolitics, business, and ethics. And now, in the second season, we reach out into our network and even beyond to speak to experts and people in the fields that are being affected by technology so that we can get their perspectives and learn from them. In this first episode, we are really excited to have Ruth Cabal, who is a former CNN journalist that recently covered the Philippines election. And we really try to understand how is it that elections, not just in the Philippines, but around the world, are affected by technology. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. Hi, Ruth. It's wonderful to have you here at Rethinking Tech. I'm really excited about the conversation that we're going to be having today, especially since the Philippines just went through the elections. But why don't we start a little bit at the beginning? Would you mind giving an introduction to yourself? What is it that you do?
Well, hello, Harinda. I'm a Philippine-based journalist. I've been working as a reporter for more than 20 years. Started on the field doing politics, crime stories, climate stories, and now I'm actually a news anchor, so I'm more in the studio. But I've also been doing some special reports, investigative reports. Yeah, just as you mentioned, we just had our elections, and just this Monday, so that was just a few days ago, I've been covering and I've been really focusing on our special coverage for the elections. I've been working with some of the biggest networks in the country, and then CNN Philippines was the most recent before my network now. So I had a bit of experience in dealing with international news aside from the Philippines. Now I really enjoy covering politics and the elections, and that's why I'm here. And accidentally, I became an advocate for responsible use of artificial intelligence, and you would know that, of course. That's how we met.
Exactly. And in fact,
Yeah,
for the audience, I think it
yeah.
would be really helpful to be able to understand, how is it that we met? I had reached out to you because of an experience that you went through, and I think it was both a terrifying experience, but also one that people could learn a lot from, especially from, a profile such as yours. Could you maybe talk a little bit about what you were going through?
Yeah, well, in late 2023, I was surprised that I was getting messages about a certain video featuring myself. In the past, I wouldn't really pay attention to those messages because I've seen some videos which are like very raw and they would just use it for online games or whatever. And it was pretty obvious that it was fake, so I didn't really mind. But then this version of this video was a deep fake. So it really featured me doing my news on CNN Philippines. I remember doing that episode, but they put in a different audio. And when I first heard it, I actually thought it was me. It actually really sounded like me, except that it was pronouncing words differently. And it was endorsing some sort of an investment program. And it was even mentioning a senator's name promoting that program. So because there's a lot of disinformation, a lot of fake news, a lot of scams in the Philippines. I mean, I was alarmed that people might think it was a legitimate news report, that I'm reporting it on CNN Philippines. So I tried to report it to my office, and it turns out that I was actually the second news anchor to have that version. But this was like an awakening for me because I never thought that this could happen to a reporter, because we've heard you have actors and actresses or politicians having those deep fakes, but we're supposed to be known for our credibility, for reporting the facts. And now they're actually targeting us, because of these values that we represent. So I didn't know that was going to be a big thing when I posted about it on LinkedIn. And that's how I realized that worldwide, like a lot of foreign journalists reacted to it, and even tech experts, they were saying that it was a direct example of how it threatens media, which is a very important part of society. So that's how I started feeling about AI, which is like fearful. But now I'm actually trying to learn and see that it has advantages too. But that's my introduction to generative AI. So it wasn't really a good experience.
And in fact, one of the things that we know, the reason that they target journalists is because of this trust that you have established with an audience. And to be able to get right in between it, of course, eventually it's going to be dispelled as fake news. But the thing that we know is that statistically, people really fall for deep fakes because of this very short time frame. And because we're in this world in which people are constantly consuming information, that soundbite, it really does create a huge uptick. And you can imagine the volume, right? It's not just one news report. That would have been really, really scary and unfortunate as well for your audience, right? Because they start seeing a different version of you starting to take sides, essentially. So Ruth, actually, one of the things that we do normally is we have a discussion about an article or piece of media that has made us reflect about the times that we're in. It could be technology related, but not necessarily. I'd love to hear in the last few days or the last week, what is it that you've seen that's been on your mind?
Well, I guess the whole world knows about the new Pope, Pope Leo the 14th. We're a mostly Catholic country, like 80% of Filipinos are Catholic. So we really closely monitored the conclave and the election of the new Pope. And what I really found interesting this week, well, aside from our elections, was that how Pope Leo the 14th chose his name. And of course, reports would say that it is because of how he views artificial intelligence as a threat to to humans, because he said that he patterned it after Pope Leo the 13th, who was against the Industrial Revolution in the late 1800s, and he was pushing for workers' rights, proper wages and protection, arrest, simple things like that, that Pope Leo the 13th advocated before. So it's very interesting when I was trying to think about why he chose that name, because I covered the conclave at the Vatican in 2013, and Pope Francis then was explaining that he chose Francis because Saint Francis of Assisi, of poverty, of humility. And now you have a pope who's actually highlighting this problem of the threat of artificial intelligence. So it was the new pope said it's the new industrial revolution, and that it poses a challenge to the defense of human dignity, justice, and labor. So it makes it even more real that this threat of AI. So I like the way that he chose his name for that, because we know that this is the future, but that we have to really do something about it now. I mean, the potentials and, of course, the threats.
No, I agree with you. I've noticed that even for myself, I've been posting a lot with regards to the Pope, and I'm not particularly religious, but I
Yeah.
actually think that this conversation is one of the most important that we're having today. Is we talk a lot about the potentials, which in my opinion have not necessarily materialized, even at the humanity level, which is what all the tech companies are talking about. But we're not necessarily, we're definitely seeing the negatives, right? We're seeing a lot of the challenges. We're even seeing the job market take a hit. We're seeing deep fakes, as you were saying, but we're seeing election manipulation and all of these things that are such challenging topics really take the media in a completely different direction and different light. And in fact, one of the things I also was curious about, because of the way that the string of events happened, I was incredibly surprised that it was an American pope. And I was thinking that there was
Yes, that's
something
true.
sinister, right? So you're thinking, okay, well, look at the string of events, how the US has been part of the last few days of the previous pope's life, that I felt like it was being architected in a completely different light. And maybe it was. Not necessarily in the way that one would assume, because in the end, Pope Leo is actually, he's quite contrary to many of the different policy decisions and positions that the US administration has taken so far.
They were saying he's even the least American of all the American cardinals who were there at the conclave. So it was interesting. My first reaction was, what? An American pope? And eventually, when you get to find out who he is, you'll slowly understand.
Yes, the substance behind the decision. From my side, one of the articles and events is literally what's happening in these days, where Donald Trump is traveling to the Middle East. And I'm starting to see that the reason that I find this interesting is, of course, this is a state visit and there's certain important deals happening. But one of the things that I'm also very curious about is I'm also seeing a shift in the tides of sentiment, right? How people are speaking about Donald Trump. You know, he's taken a lot of business leaders, a lot of tech leaders to have discussions to garner deals. But I'm also noticing that there's a shift in this feeling towards Donald Trump, in which he's removed the sanctions from Syria. And this has got him a lot of political goodwill. He's now playing the soft power card, which he had removed for the first 100 days or more from the U.S. administration. He's playing it in a completely different light, and I find that the way it's all playing out is incredibly, incredibly interesting.
And now you'll probably see that all this is all about negotiations and compromise and trying to just get everybody on the table and to talk. It's the businessman in him. Yeah.
Exactly. I think one of the things that has been lost in the narrative over the last, 100 plus days is the fact that international politics had to be played in one way. It was with diplomacy, it was with formality, it was really all of these international agreements, etc. And so when he took the actions that he did over the last few months, it's a completely different objective, but also a different approach. Because previously it was a different objective, but the same approach, right? And the way they would meet and all the political discussions, you would still see bureaucracy and politics in the same direction. And so now I find that this new class of politics is really interesting to observe.
It would seem at all very drastic in the beginning, and then eventually he has other tricks up his sleeves.
He definitely seems to have some more tricks up his sleeve.
Yeah.
So why don't we jump into the topic? Because today we're talking about elections. We're talking about the elections that happened just in the Philippines. And eventually I'd also like to evolve the conversation a little bit to the effects that we are seeing in elections around the world. Would you mind giving me a rundown, quick contextual background with regards to what I was describing as a quite dramatic election in the Philippines?
Yeah. So the elections that we had, midterm elections, so we didn't vote for a president and a vice president, but we voted for members of Congress, senators, House of Representatives. We also had local governors like mayors. So it's basically more than 18,000 posts. We have 68 million voters of our 114 million population. But the crucial thing here is about the senators who won in the elections, because these senators, the 12 senators that we voted for, will be part of the 24 senators who will form the impeachment court. So our vice president is actually going through an impeachment trial, and our vice president, Sara Duterte, who is the daughter of the former president who is detained at the International Criminal Court. So now it's actually about how that impeachment trial will play out. So it's our president, Marcos, versus our vice president, Duterte, who will be undergoing impeachment for culpable violation of the Constitution, betrayal of public trust, other high crimes, largely because of misuse of funds and the threats she made against the president, the first lady, and the House Speaker. So people are saying that the elections is actually a battle between the Marcoses and the Dutertes. As you know, the former president, who is the father of the vice president, was arrested in March and is now detained at the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanities. And as you also know that he was actually the first president when he won in 2016 who admitted to using trolls, which actually helped him win the elections. And I know you follow Maria Ressa, our first Nobel Peace Prize winner, and she was actually her Rappler website media network actually was the first one who exposed this. And she said it was weaponizing disinformation, weaponizing fake news. And that's how, by driving the narrative, using the same hashtags, using coordinated posts, that's how a lot of the troll farms worked to prop up the candidacy of then candidate Duterte. We were patient zero because we were actually the first ones to have experienced that kind of disinformation campaign. So fast forward to now, again, the trolls were at it when former President Duterte was arrested in March by the International Criminal Court. There was an interesting study in March during his arrest that by this Israel-based tech firm Kayabra, it's Reuters which released the exclusive report for this. It said that 32% of the accounts that were commenting during the arrest were fake because they wanted to get sympathy for the president. They wanted to amplify the narrative that he was kidnapped and it wasn't an arrest because the Philippines is no longer a member of the International Criminal Court. They were saying it was a story of foreign interference. It was against our sovereignty. So they were all talking about these scenarios or this narrative. And then in connection with that study, that firm also connected it with how the posts are affecting the elections. They also said that there was up to 45% of the discussions about the elections were again from inauthentic accounts, so from trolls. And maybe you could explain this. In their report, they said the inauthentic accounts included sock puppets, avatars, and bots. They said their process is they use AI to identify the fake accounts. So in that report, they said that what they found in the Philippines isn't just disinformation spike, it's digital warfare. So that's from the March arrest. Now, moving forward to May, which is our elections, a lot of the candidates of Duterte, endorsed by the Duterte, surprisingly won and landed in the top spots. In the past surveys, they weren't doing very well. So his number one aide, his like office aide, like assistant who became senator in the last term, he actually won. So he ended up as being the number one with the most votes for senator. I mean, the official votes, the official proclamation hasn't happened. But in the past, he wasn't supposed to be number one. And his rating picked up during the arrest when there's a lot of disinformation and sympathy for the former president. And Duterte's former police chief also ended up in the number 3 spot for the senatorial race. And another one of his supporters, even myself, I didn't expect like a congressman. His name is Congressman Marcoleta. He was in the surveys, he was out of the magic 12. He was like number 15, 16. And then he ended up being at number 6 with the partial unofficial results now. So I'm thinking that this actually had an effect, the way that disinformation started with the arrest in March, and we have April, May with the elections. Even though there were still a lot of the Marcos administration candidates who won, there were like 6 candidates who are in the Magic 12. I think that the disinformation still had a big effect on the result now. And again, that could impact to the Marcos Duterte conflict because these senators will vote whether or not to impeach the vice president who is a Duterte, who is the daughter.
One of the things that I'd like to be able to do is break this topic down, right? Because I think we have 3 main aspects. One is the different players, because in the Philippines, you have these 2 main players and then all of the cadre of politicians that surround them. And there's a term that you taught me, which is political butterflies, that I think is worthwhile a discussion. But then the second thing is there's an entire technology infrastructure that's enabling all of this movement to be able to shift elections, to be able to shift public sentiment, to be able to get the International Criminal Court to change opinions. And then the final thing is also being able to relate how the Philippines election also does connect to foreign elections and the effects of all of these different movements and patterns. So let's maybe start a little bit with regards to the players, right? We are talking about 2 different political dynasties going back decades in time with regards to 2 main families. Can you explain a little bit of the layering of history? Because I understand Marcos Sr., there's a lot of, let's say, history behind that. Bongbong came into power, essentially there was a complete shift in the narrative, and we'll eventually talk about the technology that made that happen, but I'd love for you to be able to help us digest who the players are as well.
So our president now is President Bongbong Marcos Jr. He is the son of former President Ferdinand Marcos Sr. And during his father's time, there were a lot of documented human rights violations because he imposed martial law. The country is acknowledging that because we actually have a law giving compensation to more than 11,000 victims. So you can't argue anymore about, human rights violations during their time because there's a law supporting compensation for these victims. And then fast forward to 2022, you have another Marcos as president. And at that time, his running mate is actually Sara Duterte, the daughter. So they were allies. So the Marcoses and the Dutertes ran together in 2022. They were allies. They were called a uniteam because it's like they're united. And eventually, 3 years after, we're now 2022, they've fallen out of favor, and then they're now considered as political opponents, which got worse because they were saying that President Marcos allowed the father, former President Duterte, to be arrested. So now they're at an opposite ends of the political spectrum. So now the unit team has been, disbanded. And I was telling you also that the characteristics of Philippine politics is you don't have permanent friends, only, permanent enemies. And whatever happens, you will be friends one time and then you're going to be enemies the second elections and friends again the third elections. And I was telling you that we call them political butterflies because they can just fly around to different political parties. It's not as definitive as having a Republican or the Democrat, and then you all have these values and you all have these standard issues. That's very clear because we have a multi-party system. So we have a lot of political parties. So one politician can just move to another party, whichever suits him or whichever he thinks will benefit his political career. So that's what happens now. When they ran in 2022, the Marcos and the Dutertes were together because they had to unite against the opposition. And now they're not together, and they could even be main opponents for the next presidential elections. It's just like 3 years that they were disbanded as a uni team. So they're opponents now.
What I find really interesting, I did end up finding out that even Donald Trump has moved parties. Back in 2001, he was a Republican that had moved over to become a Democrat. Then in 2009, he went back to becoming a Republican. In 2011, he went independent. And then 2012, he became a Republican. And that's interesting also because in typical US politics, but also many other political spheres in Western democracies, what you see is that you don't see a lot of this movement. But, you know, I'm originally from Sri Lanka. This is a very typical thing where a lot of people expect it. They expect a lot of the politicians to be able to move around according to convenience, just taking advantage of what the situation in the political state. So it's quite normalized, right, in the Philippines. And I'm kind of curious, how do the people observe this in the Philippines? Because in Western democracies, when we're talking about the US, Canada, etc., when you do make this, it's called flip-flopping. And you know, this is whether it's your political
Yeah.
party, whether it's your position, it starts to really decay trust. But there's a completely different way of looking at it in the Philippines and in many, many other countries.
Well, to be honest, they don't really care because most Filipinos don't really look at the political parties or where they stand on issues. We always say that the politics here is still personality based. It's not based on principles or values or platforms, even because we have a lot of actors who won in the Senate. We have a former president who's an actor, former President Estrada. And then we have a lot of actors in the Senate, action stars even. Manny Pacquiao was once a senator, the boxer. By the way, he lost in this election. So he ran for Senate and then he lost this election. So that's how people would generally describe. So they don't really care which party you're from. They would just see if they know you. That's why in some of our campaigns, you would see senatorial candidates dancing and singing or doing games or giving away prizes and stuff, because it's just recently that the Commission on Elections, the poll body, has been requiring candidates to attend debates. Well, not really requiring, but encouraging candidates to attend debates that hosted by media organizations, but a lot of them still don't show up because they wanted to make it more intelligent or more high level discussions. But that's not how Filipino voters are right now. But for this election, some of the surprise winners were actually former lawmakers. They had track record, they had platforms, and they were saying that this is actually a good sign that Filipino voters are getting more intelligent or are paying more attention to issues now. And they're largely also crediting this to the fact that more than 60% of the voters now are Gen Zs and millennials. There's still not, solid proof about them voting the right or the good candidates or the better candidates. So there's a study done if they really did vote for these candidates with track record, who were former senators, who were former officials, who had no corruption issues. But still, it's a step forward. But you still have the traditional politicians who are like members of the political dynasty. So there's still that. But at least it's improving in a way. But until you form the whole structure, the whole political system, where you have political parties who espouse or who advocate for particular issues about workers, for teachers, for fighting for a sovereignty in the West Philippine Sea or South China Sea. Those are the important issues that people still want to give importance to. For now, we're still mostly personality based.
In fact, I think the point that you made, which is that a large part, if not the majority of the voters are in the younger demographics, right? And this is the part where I believe it's valuable for us to transition a little bit with regards to the digital sphere. My understanding is around about 80% of the Philippines is connected to the internet on Facebook or only via Facebook. So Facebook has had a program for many years which provides free internet access directly to use Facebook. And so Facebook really is the internet for many, many people. And when that is the case, one of the things that we talk about is how people are very primed to focus on short form content, social media network content, and how that really molds their information layer. And the part that I'm kind of curious about is, what have you seen when it comes to the use of social media, the use of digital tools in the population, right? This could be even with the elections, but in general, how have you seen that politicians are starting to leverage this network traffic specifically for their benefit, either at elections or beyond?
For this elections, because it's midterm elections, the use of social media is there, but the attacks for disinformation, it's not really that intense because you have a lot of candidates. You don't have president or the vice president running, but a lot of the ads are still targeted for social media. Again, it's not as intense in spreading disinformation. And I was just looking at a study by one of the survey firms. It's called Pulse Asia. And for this elections, they were saying that a lot of the voters still made their decisions based on what they would still get their news or information. Surprisingly, on TV, it's still at 83%. And then information from the internet is just at 72%. So we're more traditionally still looking at info based on what mainstream media for now. But I think in a way, social media, because we're like top users of Facebook, of YouTube, of TikTok, in a way, it still influences. Even our politicians are still putting in ads on television and radio for these elections. So we're still more on that traditional style of campaigning. And even for person to person, house to house, that's how we do campaigning here. Politicians would shake your hands, would go to wet markets or like go from house to house to meet people. And they still do that. There's an attempt to like put some ads on social media, but not as much when they do it for presidential and vice presidential elections. And to be fair, this is the first elections that Commission on Elections came out with regulations for the use of social media. They required candidates to register their social media accounts so that they can monitor. So this is the first time that they did that. And then they required them also to declare if AI was used for an ad or for any written press statement. But I was just interviewing the poll chairman this morning on my radio show, and he was saying that we have 18,000 posts up for grabs. So if you have one or two person running for a post, that's hundreds of thousands of candidates. But he says that they only received 5 reports connected to social media activities. Of all the hundreds of thousands of candidates, today they only got 5 reports. Like, how can you even monitor if there are violations? So, I mean, we're still very raw in terms of, regulating social media for elections or even trying to take advantage of it. Aside from, of course, using the troll farms or using it to spread disinformation.
And in fact, I do think that it's worthwhile for us to go into the weeds, right, and talk about trolls. Because one of the things about the Philippines that I read many years ago was the fact that, and I'll use the parallel to fast food. So when fast food companies in the US want to test a new menu item, they go to Ohio. And when social media companies want to test a new feature, they go to the Philippines. And I read this many years ago, and the reason for it is because it's not just that social media is so well penetrated into the Philippines market, but it's also there's a real hunger for what is new and to really try it out. And so there's this culture in the Philippines to do so. And so this is one of the things that lays a very healthy seed bed when you do start talking about things like trolls. I remember when I was doing some research for President Duterte's entry into power, he had actually, there's loose documentation out there to say that they had been involved with Cambridge Analytica, the very controversial company in the end got unearthed as the player behind the Facebook scandal. So the part that I think is really interesting when we talk about that is that Cambridge Analytica came out making very explicit statements such as they had 100% campaign success rate worldwide, because at that time it was such a new form of using user data and using these new methodologies of trolls, as an example. And one of the things that they had done very successfully is they had started years before in terms of creating positive sentiment with Duterte. So they did this also later on, even for the 2022 elections, in which essentially they used things like trolls. They used a number of disinformation campaigns across thousands of accounts to be able to essentially flood the internet in the Philippines. So it allows people to view content not necessarily anchored in truth and then share it, and then it becomes viral. And in fact, there's so many examples of viral content was going around. This is sort of the foundation, let's say, that the Philippines is working with. Can you tell me a little bit about what is it that you have seen as the successes of the use of things like trolls when it comes to election campaigns, even at the presidential level?
Well, you already mentioned about how the Duterte campaign became successful because, admittedly, even his own people said that they did hire people in one room, putting out posts at the same coordinated posts, same hashtags, same messages. They even made use of overseas workers because they would do their work in the morning and then they would do the troll farms in the evening because they had different time zones and they were paid for it. So they admitted that, and it really is a classic example of how that helped put the president in power. And then it continued after that because there were also a lot of misinformation targeted at journalists because we would, of course, we would always report the facts or we would always expose issues. And then literally all these trolls or bashers would just even make rape threats to female journalists who would report negatively about the president. So that's how volatile the scene was during the Duterte administration. And then not really self censoring yourself, but it came to a point when you would really be careful about how you write your story because you didn't want to get trolled or you didn't want to get bashed when you write something negative about him. So in a way, it sort of changed how media worked at that time because we were always conscious about these trolls or about how they would hurt the network or how they would hurt our credibility as a journalist. And it's not hurting you physically, but there's that concerted effort to like bash you all together by thousands of Duterte supporters.
One of the things that I think is really interesting that's been happening with the troll environment. So you were mentioning the younger demographic, and a lot of them are not anchored in history. So when you do serve them with information that isn't really connected to truth, they aren't necessarily understanding or remembering what actually happened. And so this allows them to form new
Yeah.
memories and
Yeah.
new thought processes that put some of these candidates in a positive light when it's not necessarily the truth or the case that they should have. And when you do that, you're amplified by the volume of content that's out there.
What you're talking about exactly was what happened during the campaign of President Marcos now, because a lot of people were using TikTok to paint his family in a positive light. His father is largely regarded as a dictator, but you would see TikTok videos of the family before doing good stuff with all of their projects, like the things they built for the Philippines, the things they did. So we call that historical revisionism. So they're revising history. They're trying to tell it into a different story. So there was really a lot of people who fought against historical revisionism because you don't have to change history because it happened. There are people who experienced it, but the younger generation would only know of it from TikTok. And, they couldn't tell which is true and which is false and just go to history books. Then after that, when they were already in power, there was even an attempt to change the books that they're using in school. So there was like a lot of debate about why do you want to change the history books or why do you want to change history, change the events or tell it in a different way when it already happened, and just ask your grandmother or your grandfather what they had to go through at that time. Just, don't watch your TikTok videos anymore.
Though there are many statistics that are showing that people spend much more time on social media than with their family
Yeah.
members. The way I've heard it is actually historical amnesia, but revisionism works just as well. And there's something really interesting that's happening that's not just in the Philippines with regards to truth-based information. There's several governments out around the world in which they are actually scrubbing the truth-based information that's available on public websites. And this has two different effects. One is that people that are actually trying to be able to access truth-based information, especially off of government sites, libraries, etc., they're lesser and lesser able to do so. But the other thing that I find also really interesting is many of us are using LLMs like ChatGPT. And ChatGPT
Yeah.
relies on the
Yeah.
scraping of the internet to then be able to generate insights. And of course, we also know that that's not a perfect process, right? There's some hallucinations that
Yeah.
happen. So already the LLM is architected to give you fake news per se. But if you take the truth-based information away from the internet, you fill it with more AI, bot-based information, disinformation, what you end up having is people using these ChatGPT type tools to be able to inform themselves and others with fake news. And I find that this is
Yeah.
accelerating more and more, and people have less time, less care to make sure that what they are putting out in the world is of relevance, right? Of truth. And this is for me a very challenging issue because I don't see the trend reversing anytime soon.
In a country like the Philippines, where there's a lot of disinformation and fake news, how can you train the bots with real information, historical information? So, how can it shift through all that information? How can it discern which is fake news or not, especially for us here in the Philippines? And we were also taught to try to make the bot check itself. But again, what if the training data that it has is based on fake news? Like, you're just going round and round with the same thing, and no one's correcting you. So there's a danger in that. Our country is a unique country where people have a hard time discerning which is true, which is fake, and which is like just misinformation or disinformation. So it's really hard for certain scenarios or for certain data.
And, I'm trying to mask this because we're talking about misinformation and fake news. We're talking about troll armies and bot farms. We're talking about deepfakes and AI-based propaganda. This is a lot for a lot of us to digest already. And there's another factor that's been in place for a long time, which is called micro-targeting, right? So when social media platforms, when Google and search platforms are scraping all of our individual data, they're really able to precisely target you with ads. So you take all of this information and you really have a precision targeting system to microdose you with fake news and disinformation and all sorts of these kinds of things. It's a masterful architecture. I'm kind of curious about your approach as a journalist. How is it that you are sort of defending your own mind and your approach to learning and absorbing new information, given that this is really the architecture that surrounds you and all of us?
As a journalist, I think I still feel pretty safe that my work as a journalist is still protected because I'm in a big network. The problem is like the local, the small firms, or like the community media outfits. Like, how can they fight against disinformation or fake news? For example, they publish a story about corruption in the province, or the local politician who can easily just change the narrative and say, oh, that newspaper is being paid, they're doing fake news. How can they protect themselves? I'm more concerned about the smaller ones. But here, for bigger networks like us, we're still very conservative about using AI. For now, I don't see that as becoming a problem in the next few years. That's why I'm also trying to study how it would help us in our work as a journalist. But we still have to use our own material, start with our original work before we can feed it to the LLM, to the bot, for it to do something with it. So I'm still on the conservative side of not wanting to use much of AI. I mean, it's basic. It's always before, when we had fake news, before when we had other technological innovations. I would always say that if you're a trained journalist, if you're an experienced journalist, nothing changes that. You still have to go through the process of verifying your data, confirming your data with your sources, putting context to your story. So I don't think an AI can do that, or it's all about still determining which angle or which part of the story would be important to your viewers. So you still have to process that as a human. It's all about, human connection, how you will communicate with them and how you make sure that it touches them or your story affects them and what it will mean for them. So as a journalist, we are still trained to do that. I don't think you can train an AI to put context or to interpret how this would affect, how high prices of rice would emotionally affect a mother who has to work, for those kind of stories that are very emotional. I don't think AI can do that. So yeah, so my answer would be still doing the same thing that I do as a journalist, holding the same standard of accountability.
I do appreciate that from journalists. And here's the thing that concerns me is less about the professionally educated and experienced journalists, but it's this shift of news consumption toward bloggers, vloggers, and the independent media. And when I say
Yeah.
independent,
Yeah.
it's because also we're unsure about the interests that lie underneath, right? And so one of the things that I saw recently was there was a video capturing the US administration press office when the White House has a press briefing. You can see sort of the layout of the room. And you have legacy media that
Yeah.
has the center of the room, and we're starting to see bloggers, vloggers, and independent media sort of
Yeah.
take the outsides. And One of the things that I find really interesting is that there's two dynamics that are at play. One is you're seeing that the mix of people in the room is starting to shift, albeit slowly, to have more of these bloggers and vloggers to be present. The second thing is
Yeah.
also because you have all of these different players, the press office and the US administration is one example, but this happens all over for any PR office, is that they will select individuals to help the narrative of what they are trying to say and build. And I'm kind of curious in the Philippines, is this also something that you're seeing, whether it's the introduction of bloggers and vloggers and this format of news, but also the leveraging of these individuals for the political press to be able to shift the narrative away from legacy media?
Well, the good thing about that is there was an effort to do that during the Duterte administration. So for like our White House, so we call it Malacanang, they wanted to put in and accredit vloggers at that time. And all the legacy media fought back against it. So it didn't push through. So now it's back to the old system of having like the newspapers and the TV networks in the Malacanang or in the presidential beat. But of course, there are still some bloggers who are responsible enough to do their work properly. And from time to time, there would still be vloggers and bloggers covering important events, but they don't get regular accreditation anymore. There was an attempt during the Duterte administration, but not anymore. So that's a good thing. And then recently, there was actually an investigation in our House of Representatives about these bloggers because the congressmen themselves were victims of fake news. So they had to call for an investigation. The fact that they're investigating already these types of disinformation means that they have to even pay more attention to being responsible, to not just spreading fake news. It's like, we will make you pay, like we will make you accountable for whatever you do. And because we have this territorial dispute with China, it's also part of a bigger campaign that there are even some pro-China bloggers that they had to call in. It's that whole thing about not just simple fake news or disinformation about politicians, but even about this narrative about favoring China.
Ruth, I have a question because there's such a level of sophistication to play in this game, right? We're talking about politics, but we're talking about international governments. We're talking about leveraging trolls and bots and deploying thousands of them to be able to start manipulating elections. And we are seeing this across the world. I can imagine that there are just a very few or a handful of politicians that have the capital to be able to leverage these networks with this level of sophistication. And that's one part that is concerning because it makes it less democratic in the sense that the entry fee to get into politics is so high, right? Now, the other part for me that I'm also concerned about is who is fighting this? Is there an interest to fight this? It seems so expensive and difficult to fight it. Is there interest? Is there money behind the effort to change and shift the system back? Or is this just the new truth of the world? Is this the new way of the world?
It's a hard question. In the Philippines, we in the media would always try to fight fake news the way we can by, the stories that we do. I know there are non-government organizations that are really advocating against fake news. Our government has a lot of task forces with different names fighting fake news. We have a Department of Information and Communications Technology, and they would always say that they have this new technology to fight scams, to fight deepfakes. That's where I went to when I had a deepfake, but they couldn't really give me anything concrete about their investigation. So supposed to be, we have government agencies, but I don't see they could be as effective because already there's a lot of people who have been victimized in simple scams like love scams. There was a report where we would see how they can in real time do deep fakes and talk to the head of our FBI. We call it the National Bureau of Investigation. He demonstrated how the software actually turned him into a girl talking to someone online. I mean, if we have those scams proliferating, how can we even trust that you could protect us from all this? So that's a problem. I'm hopeful that eventually there will be more awareness of the effects of how this can really be destructive, not just in terms of scams, but in terms of in politics and in the elections and how it can threaten democracy. I'm hopeful that altogether, the government, mainstream media, the NGOs can work together to fight this.
And I'm hopeful as well because I think it's important. It's really unfortunate that this is the new state of the world and the new way to play the games, especially with politics, and especially since business is elevated to this level where unless you're political, you're not really a player anymore, right? And we're seeing this across many different countries. So let's push the play button now. And we're saying you have all of this technology, you have this infrastructure, you have these political players that are using this. How are you seeing the effects, not just in elections, but with the local economy? What are the effects on the individual mindset? Are you starting to see major trends that a lot of these technologies are really driving?
As with any other technology, of course, it always starts with fear of the unknown. What I'm doing now, and I think what you're doing now, is taking a deep dive and studying what we can about this is already the future, like this technology or this AI, and it's going to get even more sophisticated. There's no turning back. It's here. We just have to try to study how we can better use it and at the same time counter its threat. What I'm looking at now and what I'm pushing for now is clear guidelines, clear regulations for the use of AI. For example, sitting through press conferences for 2 hours, 3 hours using my tape recorder, rewinding and forwarding the sound bites and stuff. But now you have an AI who can transcribe everything. So I'm okay with that because it doesn't think, it will just transcribe whatever is on the tape. But don't try to ask it to write the whole story for you. I mean, you're a journalist, you're there to sift through the codes, you're there to sift through the angles, through the BS that the speaker is feeding you or challenge whatever this person, this politician is saying. So I still want some guidelines as to how best to use AI, but I'm not totally disregarding it because I know it's here and it's something that we have to welcome, not necessarily with open arms, maybe just be cautious and see what's out there and try to just be open to it.
And I agree with you as well, because I'm also a big believer that this is a revolution, either whether we choose it or not. But at the same time, whether it actually is a revolution, because many of the technologists are saying we are yet to see the effects of AI. We're only starting to see that. And so there's still time to go, and we're on this ride, whether we like it or not. And so I too am quite hopeful in the sense that we do start anchoring many of our decisions, many of our technologies based on ethics, based on safety tools. We're not seeing that as the trend right now. We're in fact seeing the opposite of that trend. We're starting to see tech companies reduce safety parameters, reduce the exposure to risks, and just keep pushing the technology to its limits because they want to be able to see what it can truly do. And I get that from an excitement perspective because at the end of the day, I too am a technologist that really cares a lot about gadgets and the latest of cutting edge technology. And I am hopeful that there are going to also start being some tools that do help the individual citizens that are informed and surrounded by fake news, which I haven't seen to date. But I would love to be able to start seeing some of these types of tools that do help people basically be protected in some shape or form. At the end of the day, we know that even before technology was there, elections were always tampered with. That was one of the things that we know. I mean, you had given some great examples of some of the things that have been happening. But just that right now, AI and digital technologies are accelerating that tampering, and the people aren't able to catch up. I think this is one of the parts that is a bit concerning to me. That's around about all the time we have for the discussion, but I don't know if you have any closing thoughts about the topic of technology, elections, politics, anything that we've discussed that I'd love to hear before we wrap up.
I think we always still have that urge to connect, but in however way we do it, in whatever technology we do it, I just hope the human emotions, the sensitivity, the practicality of things will still be there. It's not because we want to do things faster or more convenient, or we just want to rush things, even if we haven't really studied what it's all about. I hope we keep a level-headed perspective about diving into AI and just be more cautious about always using new technology. Of course, being hopeful, but at the same time, being very careful about what's out there.
Yeah, and one thing that when you started talking about the Pope at the beginning, there's a document that the Vatican has published called Antiqua et Nova. I've been talking about it more recently because I read it, and there's two things that really resonate a lot for me. One, which is this discussion of sort of a higher dimension that we need to aspire towards, right? A lot of technology is really focused on the individual and how the individual can gain more exposure, can gain more power, can gain more money. But a lot of religions are founded on this different premise, which is sort of a higher calling, this spiritual element that I think is an interesting aspect. And then the other thing that the document really focuses on is it really sheds a light on society in general. Because we all get lost a little bit in the discussion of the latest and most cutting edge model for AI
Yeah.
and how it's going to help this company make billions and this other company make trillions, and how countries are getting separated by this, and talking about sovereign tech. But this consideration of community is really something that I am really concerned about, because we're losing that narrative. We're not talking about how it's really helping communities. We're talking about how it helps individuals. And the further we go down this path, it's going to be really hard to re-centralize. It's a little bit like now when you're bored for, the 20 seconds when you're waiting in line for something, you will pick up your phone.
Yeah.
And to undo that behavior is something that's incredibly difficult. But I do advocate that document because I think it really allows us to reframe these discussions into a higher purpose, right? Whether you're religious or
Yeah.
not, I think that this is an important aspect. Ruth, thank you so much for this discussion. It's been not just enlightening, but an actual pleasure to speak to a journalist, and a journalist of your caliber. I've really appreciated the conversation and your thoughts on the topic. Thank you so much for being
Yeah.
here.
Thank you also for inviting me.